You often hear critical scholars or whoever say that the original Gospels, namely Mark, doesn't really talk about the divinity of Jesus. Um, for various reasons, they make this claim. And then later on, it sort of develops that Jesus is God, and John reflects this as a later sort of claim. But it's not in the earlier Gospels, particularly Mark, which is what it sort of been said to be the first written gospel that the others are dependent on. And so I just want to play this and make an extra point here. It's interesting.
If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Whoa. That's in the Gospel of John. Jesus repeatedly makes divine claims for himself. And here's a striking factoid. He never does so in Matthew, Mark, or Luke.
Okay, this final question.
Yeah. My question is about the charge of blasphemy in Mark, in particular in Mark 14. And it's for Dr. Ehrman, but I'd like to hear what both of you think. So I thought I heard you saying that Jesus doesn't claim to be divine in the earlier Gospels, in particular in the Gospel of Mark. And yet we were just looking at the account of the trial before Caiaphas, where Caiaphas asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" He says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and come in the clouds of glory." And then they charge him with blasphemy. He's quoting there Psalm 110 and Daniel 7. So my question is, I just want to be clear. Is Jesus claiming to be divine there? If he's not, then why do they charge him with blasphemy in the context of a question about his identity? Yeah. And second, why does he quote Psalm 110 in Mark? I'm sorry. Well, this is part of the same question because it ties into preexistence. In Mark 12 and Mark 14, he quotes Psalm 110, which is the one psalm in the Old Testament that says, "Before the day star, I have begotten you." So isn't implicit preexistence there? So two questions in one, I hope. Sorry. My main question is he making a divine claim there? And if not, why the blasphemy charge?
Well, no, it's a complicated question, and it really would take, for a detailed exegesis, it obviously take a very long time to do. I think it's one of the more confusing passages in the Gospel of Mark, because technically speaking, Jesus does not commit a blasphemy. The chief priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus says, "I am." Now, that's not a blasphemy. He's saying, yes, I am the Messiah. There's no blasphemy claiming to be the Messiah. Messiah was just the future king of Israel. And so that's not a blasphemy. And then he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." So that's not a blasphemy. That's just referring to Daniel, that you're going to see what Daniel predicted in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. But then they cry out, blasphemy. So what's the blasphemy? So there are a number of theories about this. One theory that I don't accept is that when Jesus says, "I am," he's claiming the divine name for himself. I don't think so, because the word "I am" simply means yes. Are you the Messiah? Yes. I am the Messiah. It's not claiming the divine name. It's just how you say yes. So then if that's not the blasphemy, what is the blasphemy? I think you have to understand that for Mark himself, the author of this gospel, Jesus is the Son of Man. Jesus is coming back in glory. Jesus has been exalted to the right hand of God, and he's coming back as the judge of the earth. It's not that some anonymous Son of Man is coming. Jesus is coming. Mark thinks that's what Jesus is. So when Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man," Mark requires you to think Jesus is the Son of Man. The high priest knows that he thinks that, and so the high priest thinks he's claiming to be the Son of Man, and so he calls out blasphemy. So is it a divine claim? Well, yeah, kind of. It is. Yeah, kind of. But it's not like Jesus saying, "I and the Father are one." Sorry, I'm out of time. Pardon me? Yes, of course it's the invention of Mark. It's the invention of Mark. Yeah. Yeah, it's not this. Look, we don't know. There's no way we know what happened at the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas. This is Mark's account. So I'm talking about the historical Jesus. We don't know what happened at the trial before Caiaphas. How would we know that? Jesus would have known. I'm stopping now.
He never does so in Matthew, Mark, or Luke.
So is it a divine claim? Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, it is. Yeah, kind of. But it's not like Jesus saying, I and the Father are one. Sorry, I'm out of time.
So does Bar Ehrman think it was a divine claim? And you can ask the question of, well, is the author of Mark, who couldn't possibly know what happened at the trial, what is the author trying to depict in his narrative, which is, even according to Bart Ehrman, right, somewhat accurate, at least, largely telling an actual story of a real person. So what is Mark reporting what he believes happened as accurately as he can? And then whether he's right or wrong is another question. The thing is, it's like, even if you take the view that John's dependent on Mark and it's a development doesn't have to be a falsehood, right? It's an invention of Mark. Well, do you mean like Mark writes it down as for the story, and so he puts it into his narrative? So that it's an invention, meaning automatically a falsehood? What do you mean? Like, Mark invented it. He told the story first, which may or may not be accurate from a neutral point of view. From that sort of paradigm, it's like, you could even say it's an invention of Mark, and that could be the case in a technical sense, according to the sort of literary perspective. But that doesn't really say anything about whether or not it's accurate or true regarding what it's recording about a historical event. But even from that point of view, it seems like maybe John is influenced by what he thinks Mark is saying. And Mark came first. It's like, actually, wait a minute. Yeah, the Pharisees didn't have to take it to be a sort of divine blasphemous claim that Jesus is claiming some sort of equality with God that is impossible unless, which is blasphemy unless it's true. The question is, does Mark think that claim, are they falsely accusing Jesus of blasphemy? And it's like, well, Jesus doesn't correct them. He does use ego I me. The narrator uses that, puts that in Jesus' mouth. And that's like, it's obvious to me that people back then would have maybe wrestled with that, at least. Like, he could just be saying, yes, that's true. I am that person, the Messiah. But it's also the same phraseology as, God reveals himself to Moses as, right? I am, so I'm the self-existent one, right? That's the way, like, when they didn't know who the true God was, and God starts revealing his name and who he is to this people that he's calling to make a covenant with, so that eventually, according to the biblical narrative, save humanity through that people, which God also separated earlier in the narrative at Babel. And then he starts implementing this plan through these people who will bless all the nations of the earth as promised to Abraham. And God starts like revealing to them who he is. And that's sort of the phrase he uses to begin with, as he starts. And it's like, what is the narrative of Jesus? God revealing himself to the people in a fuller sense. And then what happens historically? Well, according to the New Testament, Jesus is that fulfillment of Jeremiah 31, which would make the true God of Israel known to the nations by a demonstration. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Obviously, the New Testament writers saw that sort of full picture narrative, and the narrative records that. So you should particularly think the author of Mark and the other Gospels are pushing that narrative because it's true. And even if John is dependent on this, it's like, what else does Mark say? Or what else does Mark record in the narrative and claim about what Jesus did and said? Well, let's look at some other things that might indicate that Mark thinks Jesus is some sort of divine or some sort of God equal with the Father. One people always love to skip over, which is early in Mark, by the way. And then we see this throughout the narrative. Jesus is constantly correcting the leaders of Israel, God's people on earth, the teachers. He's like, you're no true teacher. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't even know the scriptures. You don't even, Jesus is a rabbi. He's interpreting the law, teaching it as a rabbi. And they're accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. And he's like correcting him. He's totally debunking these false teachers and trying to correct them for their benefit. They're accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. And some nunces out there say Jesus did break the Sabbath. Well, he broke their version of the Sabbath. And by the way, if you believe in penal substitutionary atonement, that is, that Jesus is our substitute because he never sinned, he's a spotless lamb in particular, and so he bore the wrath of God for our sins. If you believe in penal substitution, like a strict sort of sense, Jesus can't break the Sabbath, okay? Your theological concept of penal substitution and how that works legally, it's a legal claim, okay? That requires Jesus not to make any legal or to be guilty of any legal demerit or infraction. Or the whole penal substitutionary atonement legal sort of rendering of the understanding is made, it would render Jesus not capable or technically proficient or sufficient or proficient or whatever to be the legal payment on that sort of framework. So despite popular belief, if you want to uphold penal substitution so that you can uphold once saved, always saved, in particularly as a non-Calvinist or a free gracer or whatever, you need Jesus. You have to make a big deal about legal infractions and sin being the cause of people being lost. These free gracers out here that are out there saying, oh, we're going to just say no one's lost because of sin. And no one's, it's like, are you insane? Your whole system of easy believism has to have that strict underpinning, because that whole idea of penal substitutionary atonement and Jesus suffering the wrath of God because of sins, but maintaining a unity between the Father and the Son, requires it to be legal, a legal sort of framework. You can't just say Jesus broke the Sabbath before the new covenant came. That's insane. It doesn't work, by the way, because you're so dependent on a legal framing of the whole thing. It's absurd. You make Jesus, you render Jesus a sinner. But of course, you probably already you already do that in a sense, because you make Jesus okay with doing away with the law, and you make Jesus breaking the Sabbath, and you make Jesus not die according to Daniel 9, because you make a gap and you put his death in the gap, so that his death, which is supposed to be the payment for your penal substitutionary atonement, you make it outside of the text, which makes him fail the prophecy, because making reconciliation for iniquity is the thing that has to happen within the 70 weeks of Daniel to be a fulfillment of prophecy to the Jew first and then to the Greek. But by rendering his death outside of that, of course, you make him not able to fulfill the prophecy as it is written. After all, let me ask you, have you not read? It is written that Jesus died and was buried according to the scriptures and then rose on the third day according to the scriptures. You make your one gospel proof text void by Jesus not fulfilling it according to the text. How ironic. Okay, so Jesus here, he says, think about this. In Mark 2, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What is he doing? Well, some people like to imagine that he's trampling the Sabbath and being a sinner and telling it's okay because I can do away with the Sabbath and sin doesn't matter. And the Sabbath was for those dirty old Jews, and I'm bringing this salvation to the nations, so I don't care about the Sabbath anymore, even though I'm under the law to redeem those who are under the law, and I haven't died yet and ratified the covenant. So I'm just trampling the Sabbath, causing Israelites to sin and to not follow after the God who gave them the Sabbath. Right. Only a moron would think that because they're not thinking clearly, because they're making up stuff as they go, because they don't have a good explanation. So better to just make up stuff to fit my agenda. No, Jesus is rebuking them for making the Sabbath into something God never intended. And then he refers to it being made for humanity. This, just like when he says, I made them male and female at the beginning, that's him referring to the way God made it originally. Same thing here. Jesus is saying, and the Son of Man, that is the messianic figure, who they understand to be claiming divinity, is also doing that here. He's claiming to be Lord of the Sabbath. Can you imagine that claim? You guys are not doing the Sabbath as God set it up at the beginning when he made it for mankind. I'm telling you how it was intended by God. Why? Because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I made it for man at the beginning. Why are you corrupting it? How can you accuse me, Lord of the Sabbath? Well, let me tell you what it is. So our Mark 2 here, we have Jesus claiming to be the maker and Lord of the Sabbath. No man could do that. You kidding me? And anybody who out there who wants to try to deny that this is not Jesus declaiming his divinity as Lord of the Sabbath, you sound just like a modalist or a oneness heretic as you define those people. I'm not going to say that about them, but your excuse to avoid this is merely the same kind of jazz that those people you criticize and call heretics. You're just taking an example from their book to peddle your sleazy theology. So I rebuke you for that.